stranger knocked on her door asking for work. But it wasn't the man that made her hesitate. It was the child behind him. Because that look in her eyes, she had only seen it once before. The night her husband died. The wind moved low across the Montana plains, dry grass bending in long waves beneath a sky that was already losing its light. Ruth Calder stood on the porch of her ranch house, one hand resting against the rough wood post, watching the horizon turn the color of old blood. 6 months. That was how long it had been since she buried her husband behind the barn. 6 months of waking before dawn, of fixing what broke, of pretending the silence inside the house didn't press against her chest like weight. The fences were failing faster now. The cattle had begun testing the weak lines, and every night the wolves came closer. Not hungry yet, but patient. At 33, Ruth was still young by most standards, but grief had a way of aging a person where no one could see. Her hands were no longer soft, her voice had grown quieter, and the house behind her felt less like a home and more like something she was trying not to lose. The neighbors had helped at first. Food, tools, words that sounded kind but didn't last long, because kindness fades when it turns into work. And a widow running a ranch this size alone was something people talked about, but didn't stay around to fix. She was about to turn back inside when she saw a movement at the far end of the road. 2 figures. Her body went still. Visitors didn't come this far out, not this late, and not without reason. Ruth stepped quietly to the door, her fingers wrapping around the rifle leaning against the wall. By the time the riders reached the gate, she was already waiting. The man dismounted first. Tall, lean, his coat worn thin by distance and weather. He moved carefully, not drunk, not careless. Behind him, a child sat still on the horse. Too still. The man removed his hat. "Ma'am, name's Jonas Hale. I was told you might be needing a ranch hand." Ruth didn't lower the rifle. "Who told you that?" "General store in Pine Ridge," he said. "Man there said you were holding this place alone. Said you wouldn't ask for help, but you might not turn it away." That sounded like Miller, always watching, always talking. "And you just decided to ride out here?" Jonas glanced back at the horse, at the small figure sitting behind him. "We've been on the road near 3 weeks. Need work, and a place to make it through winter. I can handle cattle, mend fences. I don't drink, and I don't gamble. You'll get honest work." The child slid down slowly, and that's when Ruth felt it. Something shift. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. Dust clung to her dress, patched at the hem, stitched more than once. She held a small cloth doll tight against her chest, like it was the only thing she had left. Her eyes lifted, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. Because there it was, that look. Not fear, not exactly. Something quieter, something already accepted. Ruth had seen that look before. The night the doctor stepped out of her bedroom and didn't say a word. "Papa," the girl whispered, "I'm cold." The word landed harder than it should have. Cold. Her house had been cold for months, not from weather, from absence. "What's her name?" Ruth asked, her voice softer now. Jonas answered without hesitation. "Lila. That's my girl." Ruth studied them both. The man's boots were worn through at the edges. His coat had been patched more than once, but everything about him was clean, kept, intentional, not careless, never careless. And the child, she hadn't looked away once. Ruth exhaled slowly. This was a mistake. She knew it. Letting strangers in, bringing unknown trouble to her door, risking what little she still held together. Every sensible part of her said no. But that look, she couldn't ignore it. Not again. "You can put your horses in the barn," she said finally. "There's hay in the loft." She lowered the rifle. "When you're done, come inside." "I've got food." Relief crossed the man's face, quick and carefully hidden. "We're obliged," he said quietly. As they led the horses away, the wind picked up again, rattling dry leaves across the yard. Winter was coming, but for the first time in months, Ruth Calder did not feel entirely alone facing it. Morning came early, cold light slipping through the thin edges of the window before the fire had fully died. Ruth was already awake. She always was. By the time Jonas stepped into the main room, she had coffee brewing and a ledger open on the table, numbers carefully written in tight, controlled lines. He paused in the doorway, not watching her work, watching how she held herself, like someone who didn't have the option to fail. "You always up this early?" he asked. Ruth didn't look up. "Ranch doesn't wait," she said simply. Jonas nodded once, then moved to the door, already working before the sun had fully risen. By midday, he had repaired 2 sections of fence, cleared debris from the north pasture, and reset posts that had been leaning for weeks. Ruth noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. Most men talked more than they worked. Jonas didn't, and that made him harder to read. Lila stayed near the house at first, quiet, watching everything. Not the way children usually did, not curious, careful. By afternoon, Ruth found her sitting near the steps, mending a small tear in her doll's dress. Tiny fingers, slow, precise. "You sew?" Ruth asked. Lila nodded. "My mama taught me." A pause, then softer. "Before she got sick." Ruth felt something tighten in her chest. She sat beside her, reaching for the cloth. "Small stitches," she said quietly, guiding the girl's hands. "They hold longer." Lila watched her carefully, then copied the motion. Closer this time. Stronger. From across the yard, Jonas saw it, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted. Not relief, something deeper, something he didn't let stay long. The ranch began to change, not in big ways, but in small ones that mattered. The gate stopped sagging. The chickens were fed before they started screaming. Water buckets stayed full. Work that had once taken Ruth all day was now done before sunset. But with that change came something else. Silence wasn't as heavy anymore. That night, they ate together again. 3 plates, 3 voices, even if one of them barely spoke. Jonas ate slowly, not out of hesitation, but habit, like a man used to not knowing when the next meal would come. "How long you plan to stay on the move?" Ruth asked, not looking at him directly. Jonas didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands slowly, thinking. "As long as it takes," he said finally. "For what?" This time, he met her eyes. "For things to stop following us." The room went still. Ask what that meant, but she heard it, clear enough. Trouble. Not past, not finished. Still coming. Later that night, Ruth stood by the window, watching the dark stretch across the land. The wind had died, too quiet. Behind her, she could hear Jonas settling Lila, his voice low, steady, different from the man who barely spoke outside. She turned slightly, just enough to see them through the doorway. Lila already half asleep, Jonas pulling the blanket higher around her shoulders. Careful, always careful. A man who knew how to survive and how to protect. That made him useful. It also made him dangerous. Ruth looked back out into the darkness. She had let them in, fed them, given them space. And now, whatever they were running from, was one step closer to her door. The wind didn't move. The land didn't speak. But something deep in her bones told her this. This wasn't just help. This was the beginning of something that wouldn't leave quietly. The cold came sharper that morning. Frost clung to the ground, turning every blade of grass silver. Ruth saw them first. 3 riders, cutting across the far ridge, moving with purpose. Her hand tightened around the fence post. "They're not passing through," she said quietly. Jonas followed her gaze. He didn't ask who they were. He already knew what they meant. "Get Lila inside," he said. His voice had changed, lower, harder. Ruth didn't argue. By the time the riders reached the yard, Jonas was already standing beside her, pitchfork in hand, like it might as well have been a weapon. The man in front dismounted slowly, big, heavy. A scar pulled tight across his cheek, twisting his mouth into something that never quite smiled. "Morning," he said. It didn't sound like a greeting. "Name's Calder," Ruth replied evenly. "State your business." The man's eyes shifted, not to her, to Jonas. Recognition flickered, fast, but not fast enough. "Well now," he muttered, "that saves me time." Jonas didn't move, but Ruth felt it, the shift, the stillness, like a man bracing before impact. "You're on the wrong land," Jonas said quietly. The man ignored him. "These cattle been drifting," he said, looking back at Ruth now. "Belong to a man who don't like losing what's his." "They haven't crossed the line," Ruth replied. "I keep my boundaries." The man smiled thinly. "Lines move." Jonas stepped forward. "Then you best show us where." The man's eyes snapped back to him, slow, careful. "I know you," he said. Silence fell hard. Ruth turned slightly, just enough to see Jonas from the corner of her eye. Jonas didn't answer. The man tilted his head. "Didn't expect to find you hiding behind a widow's fence." There it was. Ruth's grip tightened. Hiding. "Say what you came to say," Jonas replied, flat, controlled. The man took a step closer. "You left something unfinished," he said quietly, "and people don't like unfinished business." Behind them, Lila had stepped into the doorway. Ruth saw her too late. The girl wasn't looking at the man. She was looking at Jonas. And there it was again, that same look. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. "Go inside," Ruth said sharply. Lila didn't move. Jonas didn't turn, but his voice changed again. "Lila." That was enough. She stepped back, disappearing into the house. The man watched it all, interested now. "That yours?" he asked. Jonas didn't answer. The man exhaled slowly, then smiled again. "Tell your employer this," Jonas said, cutting through the moment. "Any cattle that cross, it's sent back. And any man who steps on this land better come ready to stay. The words landed heavy. For a moment, no one moved. Then the man chuckled, low, unimpressed. This ain't over, he said. It never is. They rode off slow, not chased, not rushed, like they already had what they came for. Silence settled again, but it wasn't the same silence. This one stayed. Ruth turned to him. Who was that? Jonas didn't answer right away. He stared at the dust left behind, like it might tell him something he didn't want to hear. Trouble, he said finally. You know him. A beat. Yes. From where? Jonas looked at her then, really looked, like he was deciding something, or hiding it. From before, he said. Not enough, and they both knew it. That night, Jonas moved his bedroll into the main room, between the door and the rest of the house. He cleaned his rifle in silence, methodical, precise. Ruth watched from the doorway. You expect them back? She asked. Jonas didn't look up. They won't send talk twice. Ruth nodded slowly. Her ranch had always been at risk. Weather, debt, time. But this was different. This was a man with a past that had just found its way to her door. The smell of smoke came first. Not strong, just enough to be wrong. Jonas was awake before the sound reached him. Years on the road had taught him that. Danger didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered. He sat up instantly. Then he heard it, a horse screaming, wood cracking. Ruth. One word, sharp, enough. She was already moving. Boots, coat, no hesitation. The barn, she said. Jonas was at the door before she finished speaking. Outside, fire. Already climbing the west wall. Flames eating through dry timber like it had been waiting for this moment. Sparks tore upward into the sky. The wind had come back, and now it was feeding it. I'll get Lila, Ruth shouted. Jonas didn't answer. He was already running, straight into the smoke. Heat hit him hard, burning his lungs, blurring his vision, but he kept moving. Stall doors, one after another, kicked open. Out, he barked. A horse bolted past him. Then another. He counted. Always counted. One missing. Through the smoke, he saw her, Lila's mare, frozen, pinned against the far wall. Jonas grabbed a blanket, threw it over her eyes, pulled hard on the rope. Move! The horse fought him, panicked, blind with fear. Behind them, a beam cracked. The roof began to give. Jonas didn't let go. He dragged her forward, step by step, until suddenly she moved. They burst out just as the roof collapsed. Flames roared behind them. The barn, gone. Jonas! Ruth's voice cut through the noise. Lila clung to her, face buried, small body shaking. My horse, she cried. Jonas pushed the reins into her hands. She's here! The girl looked up, eyes wide, then wrapped her arms around the horse's neck. No words, just relief. Fence! Ruth shouted. Jonas turned. The cattle. The corral had broken. Animals were scattering, some running straight toward the fire, others into the dark. Push them left, Jonas yelled. Ruth was already moving, on horseback, cutting them off, driving them back with sharp turns and fearless control. Jonas ran the line on foot, shouting, redirecting, forcing the herd to hold together. Lila stayed back, holding the mare steady, exactly where she was told, not moving, not crying anymore, just watching, learning. By the time the sky began to pale, the fire had burned itself out. What remained was ash, blackened beams, collapsed walls, winter feed gone, tools gone, half a season's survival gone with it. Ruth stood in the dirt, breathing hard, face streaked with soot, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Jonas walked the ground slowly, looking, reading what others wouldn't see. Then he stopped, bent down, picked something up. At one end. Dropped. Not accidental. He turned back to her. "This wasn't the wind," he said quietly. Ruth already knew. "They want us to break," she said, her voice steady, too steady. Jonas shook his head once. Then they chose the wrong place. By mid-morning, the smoke had been seen for miles, and riders began to arrive. One, then two, then more. Neighbors, men who had stayed quiet before, now standing in the yard, seeing what had been done. "They burned you out," one said. No one asked who. They already knew. A wagon rolled in before noon, then another. Lumber, tools, hands ready to work. "We rebuild," someone said. Simple, final. Ruth looked around, at the men, at the effort already starting, at something she hadn't felt in months. Not just help, support. Jonas stood beside her, silent, watching it all. "They tried to take everything," she said quietly. Jonas glanced at her. "They didn't," he replied. And for the first time, Ruth believed it. That night, the house was louder than it had ever been. Voices, movement, life. And when it finally went quiet again, Jonas sat near the door, rifle across his knees, not resting, guarding. Ruth stood in the hallway, watching him. 6 months ago, she had buried everything, or thought she had. But now, in the space between fire and ash, between loss and something new, she realized this truth. She hadn't just let them stay. She had let them become something that could be taken from her. Spring came slowly that year, like the land itself wasn't sure if it could trust the quiet again. But it came anyway. Grass pushed through blackened soil, green where fire had been. The new barn stood taller than the old one, stronger, built with hands that had chosen to stay instead of turn away. The ranch was no longer silent. There were footsteps in the mornings, voices in the evenings, laughter that didn't feel borrowed. Lila's voice carried across the yard now, clear, bright, no longer careful. She ran between the fence lines like she belonged there, because she did. Ruth stood on the porch one evening, watching her. The wind moved gently this time, not like a warning, but like something that had softened. Jonas stepped beside her. No words at first. They had learned that silence didn't always need filling. "I knocked on your door for work," he said finally. Ruth gave a small breath. "You knocked because you needed somewhere to survive." Jonas nodded. "That too." A pause, then quieter. "But I stayed for something else." Ruth turned slightly, not fully, just enough to feel the weight of what he was about to say. "I've been running a long time," Jonas said. "From men, from mistakes, from things I can't undo." He exhaled slowly. "But this place, this house, it's the first place that didn't feel like hiding." Ruth didn't answer right away, because she understood that too well. "I didn't let you stay because I trusted you," she said softly. Jonas looked at her. "I know. I let you stay because of her." Her eyes moved toward Lila. That look. Her voice thinned slightly. "I couldn't turn it away." Jonas followed her gaze. Lila had stopped in the yard, looking back at them, and for the first time there was no shadow in her eyes, no waiting, no fear, just a child being a child. "That look's gone now," Jonas said quietly. Ruth nodded. "Yes." A long silence settled between them, not heavy, not uncertain, just real. "Stay," Ruth said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. Just honest. Not for work. Not for winter. A breath. For this. Jonas didn't answer right away. He stepped closer, slow, like he understood the weight of what she was offering. Then he nodded once. "I was hoping you'd say that." Lila ran toward them then, laughing, arms wide, not asking, just knowing where she belonged. Jonas knelt, caught her easily, pulling her close. Ruth rested her hand lightly against the girl's back. 3 people, who had started as strangers, standing in the same place, no longer trying to survive alone. That night, the wind moved across Montana again, like it always had. Cold, restless, endless. But inside that house, there was light. There was warmth. There was something the land could never take away again. Not because it was strong, but because it had been chosen. And sometimes, that was the only thing that mattered.